Usually, this pursuit of individual profit and power comes at the detriment of the collective. The ever-widening wealth gap that allows for the systematic loss of rights for the 90%, while the top 1% gets all their needs taken care of. The fact that corporations are more effective in deciding public policy than the actual public who these policies affect. So how did this happen? Monopolizing industries, hoarding wealth, and exerting large influence at high levels of government. Hey y'all, it's Sarah Maria. Welcome back to my channel where we break down the problem of consumerism and its intersection with other systems of oppression, taking a deep dive into how we can be more conscious consumers and people in general. If you're shocked about the current state of US politics, don't be. What we're seeing now is the result of decades worth of policies and ideologies, not a spontaneous shift to the far right, and certainly not a spontaneous emergence of ultra-powerful big businesses. Nothing about this is unprecedented. On May 25th, 1994, Senator Bernie Sanders said, "The United States of America today is increasingly becoming an oligarchy, a nation in which a small number of people control a significant part of our wealth and also control a great deal of the power." Over 30 years ago, we were already on a fast track away from true democracy towards a more sinister system, one that gives all the power to a handful of people while simultaneously giving the masses the illusion of power. And we've been here before. The Gilded Age of the late 1800s saw firsthand the dangers of a concentrated economy in which a few men owned virtually all the means of production in major industries. These men then exerted their vast power and influence over all of society, including politics. But politics always swing on a pendulum, and dominant ideologies ebb and flow. The last time the US was dominated by monopolies, the government shifted towards policies that clamped down on these monopolies, clamped down on big business. About 50 years later, it started to swing back in favor of big businesses, with the Reagan era being the major catalyst of this shift. Today, we're living in the progressed stages of this swing back. That's why we're seeing single corporations dominating entire industries and influencing politics at the highest level. What's happening today with Trump, Musk, and big tech is a ripple effect from decades worth of policies in support of big businesses and the wealthy. The ever-widening wealth gap that allows for the systematic loss of rights for the 90%, while the top 1% gets all their needs taken care of, that's been cooking for a while. The fact that corporations are more effective in deciding public policy than the actual public who these policies affect, that too. But I think we're on the precipice of major change because the last time big businesses dominated America in a way that was very visible to all of society, society grew increasingly unstable, and the government recognized the need to clamp down on big businesses and unchecked capitalism. I'm no political scientist or economist, but understanding that everything is always on a pendulum leads me to believe that anytime something swings to one extreme, it's probably a sign that it's gonna have to start swinging back soon. The Trump era is definitely a unique one that could very well uproot the entire American empire, or it could just be the catalyst for a new chapter of American society, a society that goes back to prioritizing clamping down on big business and placing limits on capitalist greed. Let's get into it. We can't talk about corporate oligarchy without talking about the Gilded Age, which was an era of US history from the 1870s to the early 1900s, which saw rapid economic growth and industrialization following the Civil War. Factories, railroads, coal mining, oil. The US was leading the world in all of these industries. The demand for skilled labor like engineers skyrocketed, as did wages for this labor, which resulted in an influx of millions of European European immigrants, hoping to secure a better financial situation than what was possible throughout Europe at the time. It is important to note, however, that this economic development was largely in the northern and western US, while the South's infrastructure and economy were still really devastated from the Civil War and obviously riddled with social inequality and instability, with the rise of Jim Crow laws and the systematic disenfranchisement of Black Americans. Many historians refer to the Gilded Age as a time of materialistic excesses and widespread political corruption, because this was the time period that also saw oppressive wealth concentration, exploitative business practices, and monopolization of entire industries. A monopoly is a company that dominates its sector or industry, meaning that it controls the majority of the market share of its goods or services, has little to no competition, and its consumers have no real substitutes for the goods or services provided by the business. And this started to become a very popular business model. From 1895 to 1904, thousands of manufacturing firms merged into just 157 corporations. The formation of trusts is one of the mechanisms that allowed for monopolization or worked together with monopolization. In essence, a trust was an arrangement where stockholders in several companies transferred their shares to a single set of trustees. In return, these stockholders would receive a trust certificate, essentially relinquishing their voting rights but still receiving dividends. The trustees, now holding significant sway over the amalgamated companies, could coordinate policies and operations. This effectively eliminated competition among the entities under the trust, while presenting a united front against external competitors. I know this is a lot of words and a lot of information, so let's take a look at an example. One of the most famous examples of a monopoly/trust in history was Standard Oil. The Standard Oil Company was founded in 1870 by John D. Rockefeller, during a time when obviously many different oil companies were arising due to the rapid industrialization. Rockefeller felt that having all of these independent oil companies created a chaotic and inefficient market, so he began to go after competing oil companies. By 1872, he bought out, shut down, or bankrupted over 80% of his competitors. Now, because Standard Oil was becoming such a large and dominant company, they had a lot of power to control the market. For example, unlike other smaller oil companies, Standard Oil was able to negotiate discounts with railroad companies by promising 60 carloads of oil daily. Thus, Standard Oil kept their transportation costs low, something that other oil companies couldn't compete with. Then the Standard Oil Trust was formed in 1882, establishing a network of all the Standard Oil companies under one trust, which further consolidated their power. And by the late 1880s, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all of America's oil refineries. So why was this a problem? You know, he sounds like a good businessman. He sounds like he knows what he's doing. He knows how to get powerful, how to get wealthy. Well, to understand why this is a problem, you have to understand the principles that underlie capitalism. Capitalism is centered around a free market economy, meaning that the prices of goods and services is dictated by supply and demand. It also relies on the idea that competition within the market will increase the quality of these goods and services while keeping the price low. Think about how if two businesses are selling the same product, they both are competing with each other. They have to make sure that their products are good quality, and they have to make sure their prices are not way higher than their competitor. Otherwise, no one will buy their stuff, they'll just go to their competitor. In a simple way, this is how capitalism should work. It should be this self-stabilizing economic system. In theory, obviously we see that that's not always how it goes, because when monopolies and trusts form and start dominating entire industries, this eliminates the benefits of competition and opens the door to a wide range of problems like price fixing, wealth hoarding, and potentially political corruption. If you don't know, price fixing is when different competing companies decide to set a certain price for a product. This goes against free market principles because now they decide the price rather than market conditions like supply and demand deciding the price. They can conspire to keep prices high to increase their profits, and consumers won't have a choice but to pay it because the entire industry has been monopolized by one or two big players that decided to fix the price. If two companies monopolized to own all the apple orchards, they could secretly get together and say, let's both charge $10 for one apple. And who will be forced to pay $10 for one apple, even though that's an unreasonable price? The consumers, because they are now at the mercy of these monopolies. Ultimately, when monopolization happens, it benefits the owner class at the expense of everyone else. And when it becomes very publicly obvious, it will cause social instability, social unrest, and dissatisfaction, because no one is happy when a very small percentage of the population has all the money and the control, while everyone else toils away under less than ideal conditions and still barely has what they need to survive. And this is exactly what started to happen during the Gilded Age with Rockefeller and other monopolistic businessmen. They became known as robber barons, which is just a critical term that journalists started to use to refer to businessmen who used exploitative practices to amass their wealth. Those practices included unfettered consumption and destruction of natural resources, influencing high levels of government, wage slavery, squashing competition by acquiring their competitors to create monopolies and/or trusts that control the market, and schemes to sell stock at inflated prices to unsuspecting investors. An old article from 2019 says the wealth of people like John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Henry Ford, and Andrew Carnegie would by today's standards be measured in the hundreds of billions of dollars, far more than tech giants like Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and even Jeff Bezos, the wealthy individual in the world as of 2019. The article goes on to say that in 2018 dollars, Rockefeller's wealth would be about $400 billion, which at the time of writing just 5 years ago, no one was even close to that amount of wealth. But now, in 2025, the world's wealthiest person, Elon Musk, stands at exactly that amount, according to Forbes. The interesting thing is that many economists and lawyers today agree that what businessmen, robber barons like Rockefeller were doing back then had negative effects on society. And yet, we are witnessing the rise of robber barons all over again, monopolizing industries, hoarding wealth, and exerting large influence at high levels of government. So how did this happen? Going back in time for a bit again, in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was the first law banning monopolistic business practices. The Sherman Act outlaws every contract, combination, or conspiracy in restraint of trade, and any monopolization, attempted monopolization, or conspiracy to monopolize. In 1911, the Supreme Court declared Standard Oil in violation of the Sherman Act, so it was then split into 34 independent companies, many of which ended up just merging and acquiring each other to kind of become monopolies all over again. What can you do, you know? That's capitalism, baby. So while this law was helpful in busting some monopolies, the language was vague and it failed to define critical terms like trust, conspiracy, and monopoly in a way that was clear and decisive for the courts to enact. So in 1914, two other key pieces of legislation were passed: the Clayton Act and the Federal Trade Commission Act, which is what established the Federal Trade Commission, the important agency that we know today. To keep things simple, I won't go into the technicalities of each of these laws. The important thing to know is that these are three key pieces of legislation that are in place to fight monopolizing and to protect economic liberty and consumer rights to affordable quality goods and services. And they arose because of the robber barons and the social instability of the Gilded Age. Now, as I mentioned just a few moments ago, It's important to note that while these monopolies like Standard Oil were broken up by the law, it didn't necessarily stop the practice. It just let businesses know that they had to be more discreet. Mergers and acquisitions became commonplace, often framed as means of efficiency and synergy rather than overt market control. This era also saw a rise in oligopolies, where a few firms would dominate an industry, subtly coordinating without the blatant appearance of a trust. While the early 20th century was aggressive in trust busting, later years saw a more lenient approach. So the 1950s and 60s were considered the peak antitrust era, a time when the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the courts were very aggressive and skeptical of corporations merging in any way that would make one single company significantly larger, more wealthy, and more powerful. In simple terms, the peak antitrust era was a time when the US government was really clamping down on big business to preserve the benefits of a free market, well-being for the majority of the population, and ultimately to preserve democracy. This was the post-World War II era, which saw firsthand the devastating effects of fascism from Nazi Germany. When Hitler rose to power, the German economy was extremely concentrated. They had monopolies in almost every important industry. And according to the US Secretary of War at the time, Kenneth Royal, monopolies got control of Germany, brought Hitler to power, and forced virtually the whole world into war. So the rise of the peak antitrust movement in the post-World War II era was largely caused by the fear that the US could progress into fascism if we failed to uphold a competitive and diverse economy and ultimately society. Thus, the US government at the time was putting a lot of effort into busting trusts and monopolies. One of the most famous cases was the government taking down the AT&T monopoly in the early 80s, which many people today reference as a potential outline for how the Justice Department could go about breaking up big tech monopolies. So after the invention of the telephone in the late 1800s, the US started using the Bell system, which was an incredibly elaborate and vast network of all different types of corporations that came together to allow for people to start communicating by telephone across the entire country. In 1885, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company, AT&T, became the parent company overseeing the entire Bell system. The Bell system included Bell Laboratories in charge of research and development, Western Electric in charge of manufacturing, as well as several long-distance and local telephone companies. AT&T now oversaw all of this. Naturally, they became so powerful that they were able to exert significant control over the whole telecommunication system and practically crush any smaller regional companies by acquisition, buying them out, or these smaller companies just weren't able to keep up and lost out to the monopoly. One example of their monopolistic practices included only allowing phones manufactured by Western Electric to be connected to the AT&T network. Western Electric was the manufacturing arm of the Bell system that was owned by AT&T. So any other phone manufacturer was not able to get their products connected to the AT&T network that the majority of the American population used. So not only did this put strain on these other competing manufacturing companies, because now it's way harder for them to sell their products, but it also effectively forced consumers to only buy phones from Western Electric. This was eventually overturned in 1968 when the FCC, the Federal Communications Chair, ruled in favor of Carter Electronics Corporation, which was a competing phone manufacturing company. Long story short, throughout the 1900s, AT&T had to battle it out with the government and other corporations who were throwing antitrust and monopoly lawsuits their way, and for decades they were ultimately able to carry on with their monopoly after making some concessions here and there to settle the various lawsuits. But in 1974, the Department of Justice brought forth the final antitrust lawsuit that would put the nail in the coffin. It took nearly 8 years for the lawsuit to conclude, and in 1982, AT&T was officially mandated to break up their monopoly into smaller regional companies. The violations, as cited by the DOJ, were 1. Actual and potential competition in telecommunication services and equipment has been restrained and eliminated. And 2, purchasers of telecommunications service and equipment have been denied the benefits of a free and competitive market. So what happened? AT&T broke up into 7 smaller regional companies, which were called Regional Bell Operating Companies. Some people call them RBOCs. They were also referred to as baby bells. And because of that, AT&T as a company lost a lot of their value, which I guess was the idea. But over the next 25 years, these small regional companies, the baby bells, started merging and combining. Verizon, as we know it today, is actually a result of one of these mergers. And the crazy thing is, one of these baby bell companies called SBC, which I think was a result of a merger already, SBC actually became so large and powerful that they ended up buying AT&T themselves for $16 billion in 2005. And then SBC stole the name AT&T, and that is now the wireless service provider that we know of today. There was already some backlash against the antitrust movement, largely from conservative Americans who argued that big mergers and acquisitions could be a good thing for improving efficiency and innovation. They suggested that antitrust lawsuits should only be brought against businesses if their actions caused consumer harm in the form of decreased quality or increased prices. And this opposed the more accepted thought at the time, which was that the government should clamp down on any businesses that are getting too large within one industry. The big turning point was actually right after the landmark AT&T monopoly breakup case. The peak antitrust movement went out the window in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, who was a big advocate for getting the government out of the way of businesses. His emphasis on deregulation was one of the key things that won him the presidency in 1981. Reagan served as arguably the first true conservative US president in over 50 years. Reagan advanced domestic policies that featured a lessening of federal government responsibility in solving social problems, reducing restrictions on business, and implementing tax cuts. With regards to antitrust and monopoly fighting, he employed a hands-off approach and was all for letting businesses be businesses. Reagan promised to restore the free market from government regulation and encourage private enterprise, among many other conservative economic policies, which came to be known as Reaganomics. The theories that underlie Reaganomics were supply-side economics and the trickle-down theory, which are kind of synonymous terms with subtle differences, but pay close attention while I explain these theories because there are many parallels to be drawn between them and the current Trump administration. Proponents of supply-side economics believe that increasing the supply of goods and services is most important for sparking economic growth. So it encourages an increase in domestic production. This is huge on Trump's agenda, the famous drill baby drill. Supply-side economics also postulates tax cuts for the wealthy to result in increased savings and investment capacity that trickle down to the overall economy. This is also huge on Trump's agenda. His tax policies from 2017 resulted in huge savings for top earners and minimal savings for bottom earners. And that is pretty much the trickle-down theory, the belief that we should be giving tax cuts and other economic benefits to corporations and to the wealthy so that they then will have more money to invest into the economy. Reagan and conservatives in general believed that letting top earners have big tax breaks will trickle down and benefit the whole economy and all of us little people. Critics of Reaganomics say that 40 years later, we're still sitting here waiting for that trickle down. And they're not wrong. Wealth and income inequality have increased dramatically over the last few decades. From 1989 to 2016, the top 1% jumped from having 30% of the nation's wealth to about 40%. During the same time period, the bottom 90%, so everybody else, went down from having 33% to 23% of the nation's wealth. Why should we ever have a society where the top 1% has significantly more of the wealth than the other 90%? Political ideologies aside, I feel like we should all easily agree that that doesn't make any sense if you want to have a stable society. Wealth inequality will destabilize a society, and we're witnessing that, and we have witnessed it in the past. As scholar Nicole Williams puts it in this article, corporate capitalism has upheld economic interests to the detriment of societal stability. Some figures from 2024 say that the top 10% of households have 67% of total household wealth at an average of $6.9 million, while the bottom 50% of households have 2.5% of total household wealth at an average of $51,000. Trickle down, where are you? We don't know. Top 10%, 67% of household wealth. Bottom 50%, 2.5% of total household wealth. Wait until you realize that taking racial and ethnic marginalization into account only makes the disparity worse. In 2024, Black families on average owned 23 cents for every $1 of an average white family's wealth. That's 23%. Hispanic families owned 19 cents for every $1 of the average white family's wealth. That's 19%. Significant disparity there. Please understand that for any economic policy that is openly classist, i.e. giving more economic benefits to higher classes than to lower ones, minorities will always get the shortest end of the stick, thanks to structural inequalities within America's systems. That is why things like DEI exist, to mitigate the effects of structural inequalities for populations who have historically been denied access to opportunities, wealth, and resources for generations. And this video is not about that, and I can make a whole video on these structural inequalities, what they are, how long they've been in place, and the effects that they've had. So please let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. But for now, let's get back to the topic at hand. Basically, we've been living in the legacy of Reaganomics ever since. Antitrust enforcement based on the size of companies has been essentially dormant for the last 40 years. Between 1982 and 2012, market concentration of every major industry increased. And between 1996 and 2016, the number of companies on the stock market was cut in half. It is important to note that the economy that Reagan inherited was in a significant recession, and many of his policies did spark record economic growth. However, who benefited from this growth? Mostly big businesses and top earners. Economist and Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman said, yes, there was a boom in the mid-1980s as the economy recovered from a severe recession. But while the rich got much richer, there was little sustained economic improvement for most Americans. By the late 1980s, middle-class incomes were barely higher than they had been a decade before, and the poverty rate had risen. Through deregulating big business and cutting taxes for the wealthy and corporations, Reagan effectively ushered in a new era of rogue, unchecked capitalism. This is why today, in so many major industries, there are only a few companies to choose from. And this is why we are currently facing the modern day robber barons of big tech. And unfortunately, the current administration is not looking to do anything to stop rogue capitalism. In fact, the current administration in some ways is the embodiment of rogue capitalism, brought to the extreme, which many critics are likening to a fascist style of leadership. According to Investopedia, monopolies tend to arise when new products or services emerge, such as oil, telephone service, computer software, and now social media. Back then, monopolies formed from innovations around manufacturing and industrialization, oil, steel, railroads, etc. Today's alleged monopolies are monopolizing the digital world: Meta, Apple, Google, and Amazon. In 2020, the FTC sued Facebook, now under the conglomerate name Meta, alleging that the company is illegally maintaining a social network monopoly. This came after Facebook acquired its rival Instagram in 2012 and then WhatsApp in 2014, obviously needing to secure ownership over any potential threats to their dominance, because Facebook at the time knew they wouldn't really be able to keep up with the startups Instagram and WhatsApp. So instead of competing with them, they just bought them. Additionally, according to the FTC, Facebook has for years been imposing anti-competitive conditions on third-party software developers. APIs are application programming interfaces, and they have many uses, but one of them is to allow third-party apps to interface with another app. So allowing third-party apps to interface with Facebook, like the way you can be on one app and see that button connect with friends on Facebook. That's done by APIs. So Facebook was allegedly blocking third-party apps from using APIs that would connect with Facebook unless these third parties agreed to refrain from developing competing functionalities and from connecting with or promoting other social networking services. An example was in 2013 when Twitter launched the Vine app. Facebook shut down the API that would have allowed Vine to access friends via Facebook, so users on Vine wouldn't be able to interface with Facebook. Technicalities aside, from the viewpoint of the average everyday consumer like myself, Meta very visibly wields incredible power and control over the entire social media industry, and unfortunately no one is really touching them right now, except of course TikTok. That's one of the big reasons why there's so much power play going on with the whole sell TikTok to us or we ban it. Next up, Apple. In 2024, the FTC and the Justice Department filed a civil antitrust lawsuit citing that they maintain a monopoly over smartphones by undermining apps, products, and services that would otherwise make users less reliant on the iPhone. The DOJ says Apple exercises its monopoly power to extract more money from consumers, developers, content creators, artists, publishers, small businesses, and merchants, among others. Here is the list of allegations against the tech giant. It really doesn't take a law degree or a PhD in economics to see that Apple has really dominated the smartphone industry. From a consumer standpoint, I can easily see this. Yes, their products are good, but just having good products doesn't make you that dominant of a corporation. To be that dominant, you must be engaging in some kind of anti-competitive behavior to squash out your competitors. And in doing so, Apple effectively gets away with robbing consumers in broad daylight by charging astronomical prices for their products, knowing that we will flock like chickens with our heads cut off every year to get the latest iPhone and the matching MacBook and the AirPods and the AirPods Max and all the new wires that we need to keep up with the changes that they're making. Partly consumerist nonsense, which I talk about in great detail on my channel, but also partly monopolistic business practices on behalf of Apple. In 2020, the Justice Department also filed an antitrust suit against Google for monopolizing search and search advertising. Then in 2023, they also filed a suit against them, alleging that they have monopolized digital advertising technology as well. Google's anti-competitive practices include: in 2023, the FTC also brought a case against Amazon, alleging that they are illegally maintaining monopolies in both retail and technology. The complaint sets forth detailed allegations noting how Amazon is now exploiting its monopoly power to enrich itself while raising prices and degrading service for the tens of millions of American families who shop on its platform and the hundreds of thousands of businesses that rely on Amazon to reach them. As of 2025, all of these cases are still open, and obviously we're undergoing a change of power from the Biden to Trump administration, and this could very well change the outcome of these cases. Lina Khan served as the chair of the FTC under Biden, and she was very outspoken about expanding antitrust enforcement and being wary about the dangers of monopolies.
I think we're similarly at a moment where people recognize that when you have unchecked corporate power and unchecked monopoly power, that harms communities across America. It means people are paying more, making less. Our supply chains are less resilient. Small businesses, startups have less of an opportunity to get a fair shake. And ultimately, our democracy is more fragile.
With the end of the Biden administration, Lena Khan is out, and Trump chose Andrew Ferguson to be the next FTC chair. Ferguson says, under the president's leadership, we will end the previous administration's assault on the American way of life, and we will usher in a new golden age for American businesses, workers, and consumers. Will the FTC be able to win the suits against these corporations? We'll have to see. But considering that the new FTC chair seems to have a very different politic than the previous one, and that the CEOs of these alleged monopolies are very closely involved with the new president himself, I'm not too hopeful. My point in saying all of this is to emphasize a very succinct point. Capitalism always seems to turn against itself eventually, turning into the very thing it claims to hate. Proponents of capitalism say that the free market encourages healthy competition, which ultimately will benefit consumers and business people alike. The downfall, in my opinion, is that the nature of the free market system and the obsession with private property rights will always require an emphasis on individualism. Innovation will come, but at what cost? When innovation gets rewarded with profit, the one ultimate goal under capitalism, does innovation become less about benefiting society and more about individual benefit? If I invent the cure to cancer, the human in me is so excited to save lives and improve the world, but the capitalist in me would be encouraged to race to ownership of this intellectual property so that I can secure my profits. Capitalist corporations would be salivating to own rights to this innovation because they know it could make them so wealthy and powerful. And at the largest level, capitalist countries would do anything to make sure that they secure ownership of that innovation first so that they can cement their own power in the global political scheme. In my opinion, capitalism, especially when gone unchecked, encourages a race to ownership as a means of securing profit and power at an individual level more than it actually encourages healthy competition for the benefit of the collective. And usually this pursuit of individual profit and power comes at the detriment of the collective. Capitalism rewards and breeds monopoly. It's almost inevitable. But when it happens, capitalist societies like America gets surprised. They put laws in place to bust monopolies, but do nothing to bust capitalism. As long as we are deeply rooted in capitalist principles, we will continue to see monopolization, concentration of wealth and power, and when this concentration gets to a point that's very obvious to all of society, like today, we will see social instability, dissatisfaction, and upheaval. It goes without saying that with great money comes great power. After the Gilded Age that saw huge monopolies and a very concentrated economy, many people agreed that monopolies inherently went against democracy and instead supported oligarchy. Louis Brandeis, who served as a Supreme Court justice from 1916 to 1939, said, "We may have democracy or we may have wealth concentrated in the hands of a few, but we can't have both." President Woodrow Wilson, who served from 1913 to 1921, said, "If there are men in this country big enough to own the government of the United States, they are going to own it." The power held by big businesses, by the wealthy, by monopolies can be wielded within the political realm in a couple of ways. One being through overt, direct campaign contributions or campaign advertising, and another being the more subtle, sinister financial contributions to media outlets and think tanks that support their own ideology. The landmark Citizens United case of 2010 was when the Supreme Court court abolished limits on corporations' political spending. So now corporations, unions, and nonprofit organizations can pour as much money as they want into their support for a certain political candidate. In a dissenting opinion, Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens said the ruling is a rejection of the common sense of the American people, who have recognized a need to prevent corporations from undermining self-government. He also said a democracy cannot function effectively when its constituent members believe that laws are being bought and sold. The Citizens United case gave birth to what's now called a super PAC. A regular PAC, which stands for Political Action Committee, is an organization that raises and spends money to support a political candidate. But regular PACs have limits and can only receive up to $5,000 per year from each contributor, and regular PACs can donate directly to political campaigns. A super PAC can raise unlimited amounts of money, with the caveat that they can't donate directly to political campaigns, but they can spend as much money as they want on advertising and canvassing in support of a certain political candidate. Canvassing is like the door-to-door knocking and the cold calling. It's essentially like a certain group in support of a political candidate can go door to door or calling people to have direct one-on-one conversations. Elon Musk started his own super PAC called the America PAC, which he himself donated over $200 million to in support of Trump. He also donated $10 million to the Senate Leadership Fund, which supports Republican Senate candidates. These made him the largest donor in the 2024 election cycle. And surprise, surprise, now he is head of his own government entity, the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, whose goal is to cut government spending and slash federal regulations. Not even 1 month into the new administration, DOGE, spearheaded by Musk, has gained access to large parts of the federal government and is carrying out a huge overhaul of staff and systems within several agencies. The Office of Personnel Management cleared out over 40,000 employees and installed new hires, some of which had previously worked for Musk. The Wall Street Journal reported that DOGE gained access to payment systems at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid services. DOGE operatives also gained access to computer databases and medical records at the Department of Veterans Affairs. They also took over the General Services Administration, which manages federal real estate and technology. The last thing I will mention before I move on is this. David Lebrick, a top Treasury Department civil servant who was in his 11th year of service, was forced into resignation on January 31st for refusing to grant DOGE access to the Bureau of the Fiscal Service Payment Systems. This is the system that disperses Social Security payments, government paychecks, and contractor payments. After pushing Lebrick out, DOGE was able to access these systems. Coup d'etat? A coup d'etat? All of this is being spearheaded by the world's wealthiest man, who essentially bought his way into the intricate folds of the US government. No one voted for him, yet he has so much power and access. And no one is able to stop him right now because they have a very effective plan for how they're going to go about carrying out their agenda. And this is outlined in Project 2025, which, ooh, it's basically a playbook written by the Heritage Foundation, which is a conservative think tank, for what they want to see happen within the first 180 days of a conservative presidency. Y'all should check out this video. It's a great explainer video for understanding that, because I know that all of that information is relatively inaccessible to the majority of the population. So it's super important that we all try to understand this as much as we can. Check out that video, it'll be linked below. A democracy is a delicate system of checks and balances. So what happens to democracy when checks and balances go out the window. With regards to big tech and their monopolies, the CEOs under fire from Lena Khan's FTC are seen cozying up to the new administration and earn themselves a hot seat in the front row at the inauguration. Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg, who Trump literally sued in 2021 over the suspension of his accounts after the January 6th insurrection, Zuckerberg settled this lawsuit with Trump for $25 million and donated $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund, even though he previously said that he would not support a presidential candidate. Jeff Bezos and Apple CEO Tim Cook also donated handsomely to the inauguration. BBC talks of the inauguration full of big tech billionaires as a striking spectacle. The last public event in Washington to bring so many tech bosses together in the same room was a 2020 congressional hearing aimed at their companies. Daniel Kinderman, an associate professor in comparative politics and international relations, said that because the online universe can shape what we think we know and how we think and what we think, tech moguls are able to wield a particular kind of influence. If that power is concentrated and only on one side, or if it's only aligned with one set of interests, we are in very serious trouble. And we may soon be there if the tech CEOs align themselves very tightly with the new Trump administration. He goes on to say that the United States is a country of very extreme inequality. When it comes to income and wealth inequality, the US has the hallmarks of an oligarchy. Sadly, policymaking in most countries is skewed towards the elite, but this tendency is even more pronounced in the United States than in many comparable rich countries. Remember earlier in the video when I said that back in the post World War II era, there was a fear that the US could progress into fascism if we failed to uphold a competitive and diverse economy and ultimately society? Yeah, I'll let that marinate on your minds. We'll close out by reading part of the article I mentioned earlier by Nicole Williams called Our Corporate Oligarchy. Conservatives often overlook the role of capitalism, specifically corporate capitalism, in fomenting upheaval and furthering class division in American society. While free markets and private property rights are paramount to all American conservatives, corporate capitalism has wrought chaos throughout the class strata that has been a permanent feature in American society. Corporate capitalism found a willing friend in the Republican Party. They upheld economic interests to the detriment of societal stability, dismissed class division, and quickly attempted to dismantle the welfare state, whilst doing almost nothing to buoy the fortunes of the family and civil society on which many who survived on the periphery of material wealth had depended for generations. The virtues of restraint, participation in civic life, and honesty eroded in the face of capitalist virtues such as profit-seeking and instant gratification. I highly recommend reading the rest. It's linked below. And on that note, I'm sure you have a lot to think about. I know this was a very information-dense video, but I hope it was helpful for placing our current times within a larger frame of understanding. Staying aware of current events is important, but it can also drive you insane, especially if you don't understand the context of current times within a wider time frame. In some ways, today's politics are unprecedented and terrifying. In other ways, this has actually been brewing for a long time. We will be okay, but we have to get angry and get active and show the powers that be that we will not be silent in the face of our own oppression. We will not be silent watching the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And we will especially not be silent watching innocent, marginalized people get scapegoated for political power play. Resist, disrupt, rest, and read. We need you. We need you. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear them. If you like these type of videos, check out some of my previous ones and subscribe and turn on your post notifications so you can be notified every time I upload in the future. Until next time, ciao!